So I said one of the things that I'd look at doing is sharing some of my um, appendix portions of a risk report, of a longer risk report. Um, so a true risk report for me now is a fairly short document, 3 to 4 pages long, and I need to share a screen.
You
So
should be able to.
yeah, I'll do that. Um, if I share my whole screen, it should stay on my screen, and you should see a report that's open now. This is a template stage, so there's stuff that still needs to be going into it. Bits and pieces need to be done with it. The yellow stuff is for a quantitative assessment if I do one. Frequently, there's nothing there that I need to deal with nowadays, so that doesn't get there. There'll be some general maintenance stuff, and you can see here I've already got the trees numbered 23.1, 22.32, and so on. I think in this case, there's probably nothing this year. And then I've got a register that just summarizes all the things that we've had historically that are still outstanding or have been resolved. So you can see this particular year, which was 22, they did most of it. So 23 will be almost a blank schedule. Then you get a whole pile of photos, and I've gone photos half page and full page now. I was doing them 4 and 6 to a page, and the problem with 4 and 6 to a page is it's harder to see. And as you get older, as you know, you need glasses. And of course, I want to try and make it as easy as possible to communicate. So, and this is just so I can automatically cut and paste a thing back in. So if I wanted to grab an image, I can, and just it'll say replace from clipboard, change from clipboard. It's actually not set up for that at the moment. To do that, I need to go File and Info and change to compatibility mode because it was open from another computer, started from another computer. So there's room there already for some photographs. There's an arrow there just to set that as a default. So I'll just cut that out. That's no problems. And then the two trees that we looked at, I always use a date in it. So 2252, that lets me know when that was an issue. And so those are the two outstanding items for the school at the moment. And then once I've done the report and a location plan, the next thing I've got is, and please don't take me the wrong way, I'm happy if you want to put every tree in every school in or every tree on a site in. I think it's easier to find the things that you need to be worrying about if we don't complicate it. So you can tell automatically from here that there's 2 trees. And so our tree schedule should align with that same information so that there's 2 trees in that schedule, and then everyone can find things quickly. There'll be some photographs, as I said above. I have a glossary of risk terms that I put in, and I put a glossary of risk terms in just because we use words in very specific ways, and I think our industry does, that needs to be communicated. Or we use words that or phrases that may not be familiar. So ALARP, as low as reasonably practicable, it's covered in most of the work regulations. BMP, best management practice. Basic tree risk assessment, BTRA, that's the ISA's one that you get taught during track. It is not a track risk assessment. It is a BTRA risk assessment, if you haven't figured that one out yet. If you're really into trying to figure out things clearly, a QTRA, a VALID are also acceptable under the track process. So the track is just training on how you assess and what you assess. Broadly acceptable, I use 3 terms: broadly acceptable, tolerable, and unacceptable. And that falls in line with what they call the tolerability of risk framework. And there's lots of stuff in that, the internet. There's a great textbook on the subject. But QTRA adopts it, VALID adopts it indirectly, it hides it in the process. But it simply says that, you know, if the risk is generally acceptable, we don't need to worry about it. There is still some risk. So I don't have to have any clause in there that says, you know, trees still pose some level of risk. We're really upfront about it. In fact, we've got one section we tell them that's the case. Consequence, that's what's most likely not worst case outcome of a tree part failing. I'm amazed at the number of people that say, oh, yes, but the tree part could do this. Come down, bounce back over the fence, ricochet through the window and kill a kid. Yeah, it could do that. But what's it most likely to do? And that risk is concerned with likelihood, and most likely is the thing. Factor defect.
Sorry, the basic tree risk assessment you got there, could you say level 1, 2, or 3 and expand on them?
You could. I do that up in the when I give a brief introduction to the method, which is up here, just one paragraph. Again, we used to have a lot longer report, and they'd get to the stuff they needed about page 17 or 18. And what we found when we had a longer report, that these guys would never read it. They wouldn't know what to do. As it is, they still struggle to read 3 pages. I wish I could say. And in fact, the bulk of it's on the first 2 pages. They still struggle to read 2 pages of text. It's not because they're silly. It's because they're busy and it's stuff they don't want to deal with. And in part, that's why we're doing the inspections, because they don't want to do them. So here it says, I did a stage 1 visual tree assessment, defines what that is down here, and it says aerial inspections, invasive and other diagnostic fault detection procedures will generally only be recommended when visual indicators of potential concern are observed. So if I see a tree with a cavity, I just think of one, I've just finished the report today. It's a cavity in a limb or stem, sorry, it's one of 3 stems leaning over a playground. I looked at it and I said, I'd be quite happy to have that as a 6, because it's got an issue. So I've taken it from our 7 down to 6. If you're familiar with QTRA's ranking system or Valid's ranking system, same basic process. Happy with it at a 6, but I'm not certain. I'd need more information, so I'll knock it down to a 5. I'm sorry, guys. So I knock it down to a 5, which is exactly what I did in the assessment. At 5, the risk was still in the acceptable range. So no point recommending any further testing, because it's not going to have any real consequence on the process. Does that make sense? So the only time I'm going to ask for a resistograph, tomograph, aerial assessment is if I'm sitting down at maybe one in somewhere between 10,000 and 1 in 100,000. Sorry, guys. I'll just take this very quickly. Yes, lady. I need to put that. Sorry, guys. What was I saying? Yeah, so the only time I'm going to ask for one of those things is if the risk is already, if the assumed risk, assuming the worst likelihood of failure for the part, because I don't have enough information, so I've got greater uncertainty. If I assume that and it's in that tolerable range, but not as low as reasonably practical, then I'll ask for it. So it's not an everyday thing. And yes, the tree may have some real issues, but if it's the risk is already small enough, I don't need to do anything more. And a good example of that would be a tree in a 1 in a million occupation area. So to a 6 if you're using QTRA. It really doesn't matter how bad that tree is in terms of a hollow. It's already in the broadly acceptable range. So hopefully that answers the question for you, Mick. So getting back to it, the glossary terms, another one that I've got there is a hazard. And the reason I have that there is hard to believe, but I still see reports that talk about hazards and confuse the difference between a hazard and a risk. In fact, I see it regularly, not irregularly. I would say probably 5 to 10% of all reports that I read to do with risk, whether it be in this area or whether it be in some secondary area. Like I have a friend who was the work health and safety manager for Harvey Norman, and Faye would say the same thing. People just confuse terms. So want to make sure they understand the difference between them. Inclement weather, I use the phrase fairly regularly. So I'm talking about extreme weather, usually involves strong winds, heavy rains, and sometimes microburst conditions not likely to be experienced by the tree most years. So not going to get that sort of extreme conditions most years. Normal weather, on the other hand, is a range of weather conditions that are most likely to occur every year in that location. So I'm talking about, today we had near gale winds come through. Sorry, not near gale. We had strong winds come through, and they were in the range of what I'd expect most years. So that's the normal inspection cycle. That makes sense. An interim action plan. Not that I have one very often, but they're there. ISA, just because we refer to their publications and bits and pieces. Likelihood, the possibility of something occurring. And it's interesting. You'll hear risk words used and misused, and this is one of them. Instead of saying, what's the risk of this part failure? Well, it's not the risk of this part failing. It's the likelihood of this part failing. And you'll often see that, and you'll see some real doozers, like a safety hazard risk is one that I read recently in a report. The tree has a safety hazard risk. Well, that just was everything put in together. We couldn't make it sound worse, except if we said it was an insurgent terrorist safety hazard risk. So no, combining your terms doesn't make it worse. It makes it confusing. QTRA makes sense. Risk of harm makes sense. It's risk or risk of harm. Risk appraisal, that's the process that we're going through. Risk management plan. And I don't produce that. The plan to manage the risk raised on the risk assessment based on the risk thresholds and strategies of the tree owner or manager. I simply give them the information that allows them to do that. And I usually give them some form of guidance as to what are things they can do. Target is obvious. Target zone is obvious. Tolerable if ALARP, again, that's from our work health and safety. Now, Rob, you're in Victoria, aren't you? Just nod. Yeah. You guys have still got some draconian stuff going on down there. I only learned about it recently. So you're much where we were almost 20 years ago, in the sense that if something happens, there's this assumption that almost that there's strict liability, that somebody gets hurt, therefore someone must be negligent. So you haven't quite adopted this tolerable and ALARP legislatively yet, even though your legal cases are following that process. TRAC is the qualifications, unacceptable risk. And I use numbers, but you don't have to. And then the value of statistical life. And as I said, there is an Australian one. And that's just as a hypertext. If you don't know how to do that as a hypertext, let me know and I'll show you. But there's the best practice regulation for 2022 August. So for this year, the value of statistical life is 5.3 million, and the value of a life year is $227,000. So obviously a kid is worth more than an average person, but if we're talking about a random area, an average person is there. So in a school, you might want to increase that or push that up. You could argue that case. Interestingly, in COVID, we spent about 2.5 million a life year versus the 227,000. So a fairly big increase in response. Were fairly, 12.5 million, fairly disproportionate. And these sort of figures are used all the time. My favorite ones, whether we're going to put a traffic light in, whether we're going to put a roundabout in. The cost of putting a traffic light is expensive, so it's decided. So does everyone know how to make your HTML link in your document open at the right thing, but not give that horrible long thing at the top? No? Anyone, do you want to know?
Yes, we did look at it, but it was a fair while ago. Right?
So yeah, you can just go to your link and edit your hypertext link, and that's all that it is. Click on it, edit it, and then you can have it say what you want. So I've had it display value of statistical life, and that's the URL there. The URL is obviously a lot longer, and it's a boring thing. So instead, I've just given a link that allows them to go to there. So after that, I've got some details of the method used and why. Then we've talked about what our offsite takes are. I do have some limits. We say that some defects can't be determined. We then have a couple of paragraphs there. Trees that are retained and properly managed have some level of residual risk. This will by necessity mean over time there'll be numerous near misses, periodic property damage, particularly associated with storm events, and on rare occasions someone may be harmed. So it's right up front. It's in the information we send a new school to start off with. If the school tells me they need to get rid of all risk, we tell them they need to close the school down and not have students. Kids trip over, kids fall downstairs, kids get hit going to and from school, just stop education. In fact, the only way I know of really to get rid of risk is to kill people. Once you're dead, you've got no more risk. Everything up until then is about risk. Then we talk about why the difference between a hazard assessment and a risk assessment. Again, this stuff is provided, and I make that clear up here. Let me read that little phrase for you. The information following the images and the tree location plan will assist you in understanding and applying a robust approach to risk management. However, the essentials are covered in the first. The word for is coloured just so I know I've got to go back and change that, whether how many pages it will be, and it's usually 3 or 4 pages. So I would say probably 95% of my clients never read this material. It's there if they want, and it'll help them understand what they're doing. So we look at quantitative and qualitative risk. We look at risk from trees in general, where that fits. We look at the problem with being defect process. Many trees risk assessments are focused on the presence of defects. While there are benefits in being able to identify parts that are weaker or more likely to fail, the approach is wrought with issues. Most importantly, there is a tendency to correlate strength loss to an inadequacy inadequacy of the part to perform as needed. In most instances, there is nothing to support this correlation on a broad scale basis. In other words, yeah, it's lost 60 or 70% of its inside, but that doesn't mean it's inadequate. It may be, and we've looked at that previously, it may be stronger from having that issue. We just assume that everything to do with a defect is somehow or other inadequate. And then
we happy to still use the word defect, Mark?
I don't use it in the report. We use it in this and define it as to what we're saying, which is a factor. If I use the word factor there, for the audience, I think they'd lose it. They'd have to go back and figure that out. So I'd rather not use the word defect, but I think there are times when, again, our function is to try and communicate. And so, again, it's one of those glossary words. I give them benchmarking the risk from trees, and I give them what the different things are: melanoma, driving, asthma, murder, falling from or on a bed, animals, fall involving a chair, accidental tree or tree part failure, and then washer inside a building so small it's ridiculous. And the last thing I give them is a copy of David Evans's obvious tree risk features. I think that's the key stuff for me in terms of it. We've actually talked about, and I have to get consent to do so, but talked about getting this printed as an A1 poster and giving it to clients so that they can display it. Because again, I'm amazed at how inadequate they are. The assumption is now that schools are getting risk assessments done, they don't need to think about the trees anymore. And the reality is, now that they're getting the risk assessments done, they still need to think about trees, because things like this one here, this one here, this one here, this one here, these are all the results of storm events. So, we tell them that. We say to them that if a tree on the property has had a big part fail during a storm, they should go around and have a look. A responsible person should. And a little while ago, I had a school ask me what a responsible person was. And my answer was, the person that asked me that clearly is not. You know, a responsible person is a person who's able to take responsibility for what they're doing. And this is not rocket science. This is pretty basic. So that's the sort of information that I cover in the appendix. Does it need to be there? No. I reckon if I gave them the first 3 pages, that would probably cover them. Why is all the other stuff there? With the hope that occasionally someone's going to read it and get a aha moment and say, yep, this is low risk and we can deal with this effectively. And it also helps in the communication if they want to get to that stage. So, and I'm pretty sure that's the case because I looked at a risk assessment report for an organisation that's done about 180 of them in New South Wales, so, you know, reasonable size organisation. And it was really obvious that their report didn't meet the requirements of the DEC, and yet they'd never been picked up. And I assume it had never been picked up because in the 40 or 50 odd pages, nobody wants to read through and figure that sort of stuff out. Risk assessment's done. That's it. I'm done. And so from my side, they just want to know what these things say. Not too bad. And here's, you know, a simple one: avoid area and gale force winds. You know, not hard. Monitor. Remove when a tree crew is on site, and so on. Any questions on that, guys?
You priority monitor.
Yeah, so priority,
advisory.
good. In the early days, I started using some of those terms that we use: low risk and moderate risk and high risk. And the problem is that as soon as I said it was low risk, people felt something needed to be done. And I wasn't meaning that at all. So let's just say let's go down to the bottom trees that we've got here. If I had a tree like this, can you see that one? I'll zoom in and make sure it makes it a little easier. Any of these ones here, but you know, this one in particular. How quickly should that get dealt with?
It depends on the target area.
Okay, so let's put this in a fairly high use area of a school. It would want to be done fairly promptly, wouldn't it?
Yep.
And so that's what you'd say. It's urgent works. If we go to even this one here, this is maybe a shear crack, maybe a hazard beam, hard to tell. I think probably more a shear crack. How quickly does that one need to be dealt with?
I would say not as quickly as the first one we looked at.
Well, let's give these both a risk rating now. I'm going to give this a risk rating of 1 in 50,000. And this one I'm going to give a risk rating of 1 in 5 million. How quickly does this one need to be dealt with?
Well, I don't know that it needs to be dealt with at all, does it?
That's right. So if it needs to be dealt with, it needs to be dealt with. That is, the risk is not tolerable. We need to deal with it and deal with it promptly. But if it's tolerable and as low as reasonably practicable, or it's already broadly acceptable, then there's no time limit need to be given. So maintenance work is something that I say, let's go back up to that so you can see it. Oops. Maintenance work is something that doesn't need to necessarily be done. So a dead tree that's currently stable, it's not going to fall over, that posing a risk of maybe, you know, 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million, I can just ignore it. It's something that can be done, but doesn't need to be done. So I changed the priority of stuff so there was no low, medium, and high. It either needs to be done or it doesn't. Okay. If it needs to be done, then it needs to be done. How quickly it's going to be done would depend on their resources, the things they need to do. And usually they're done on the things that I'm worried about, like splitting Angoffer in a school playground that was similar to that codominant that had split. I saw it in a school. I said, you can bolt it, you could do a reduction prune and brace it, or you could remove it. You want to remove it, I'm happy for you to remove that. I'm happy to sign off to say that it's the risk posed is not acceptable. Until then, you just need to isolate that area up with some witches caps so that no one's exposed. And I'm guessing they had it removed within a week or so.
Would you have really given that one in 50,000?
That one that you see in my picture, and it was in a school in a country area of the Riverina, and I gave the school the option to retain the tree. It was
Really?
in the bounds area. There's benefits in having children see trees fail. When children see trees fail, they learn. We've got this idea that we need to sterilize it. Could I do something about it? Yes, I could remove it. But if I do that and I remove the 1 in a million risk, what other thing am I taking money from? So I've got a limited pot. And so I wouldn't do it. Advisory ones are where somebody else needs to know something, or where it's just, well, I'll give you the definitions here, in fact. Essential work required to reduce or eliminate risk that is unacceptable range or is tolerable range, but where the risk is not already as low as reasonably practicable. So in my view, any work is essential. It's not a time frame now. It's just essential that they do it. And that's going to depend on their resources and their time frame. In most cases, it's done fairly quickly because I rarely see one. I would see an essential tree job, maybe 4 times a year, something like that. They're not the norm. Secondary, implement with resources available. Risk is currently broadly acceptable or tolerable in ALUP, but it is likely to increase over time. And a good example of that would be, a big dead branch that's just died on a Eucalyptus saligna. It's not an immediate likelihood of popping out, but a year or two's time, it might be something that we need to be looking at prioritizing up. So that allows them just to think about those things. Maintenance, general maintenance work that may never need to be undertaken. However, over time, these issues may increase in priority. Dead tree, currently not an issue. I went out to school last week and there was a dead a small leaf ironbark, Eucalyptus cribra, and I gave it a bit of a shove and I heard it crack and I thought, yep, I'm going to wait until the students are all inside and I'm going to push it over, which is what I did. Now, the risk from that tree had slowly increased and slowly increased and slowly increased. Monitor, often best managed by monitoring the tree for changes after inclement weather and a formal risk assessments. Alternate management option may be provided where a reasonable alternative exists. And there's lots of things, cavities I monitor all the time. Tree health issues, they're just things that are monitored. And advisory, trees that pose a broadly acceptable risk, but where providing information to relevant parties may reduce the risk or otherwise be of benefit. Informing you completes this issue. So once I've told them that they should know about this, then that's it. And that's done. A neighbour's tree that's looking dodgy and they need to let the neighbour know, something like that would be in that category. And why is it completed? Because if I don't say that, then every year I'm going to have it in there and I just want to get stuff out of that register, not in there. So the assumption is that they've dealt with it. Does that answer your questions, Mick?
Yep.
Yeah. So low, medium, and high. I would come back with low, and we're talking about low being 1 in a million or less than 1 in a million. And I'd go back to a tree with a cavity that was low, and they've cut the tree down because the tree poses a risk. And in New South Wales, under our SEP, our State Environmental Planning Policy for schools, if we believe that the tree is dangerous, then they can remove the tree without consent. Well, you only have to say risk and the tree is dangerous. So we just saw it as a way of trying to reduce that process.
Mark, what do you think about the regularity of school inspections? I've just found after I've been to a school for a couple of years in a row, generally most of the trees are pretty much okay. And then they want me to go back next year and I tend to think, well, look, I'm taking your money for no real reason.
Yeah, good question, Rob. I have an answer for that in writing. Unless a significant change is observed in any of the trees, a re-inspection of the trees by a risk expert is not required for 5 years. Now, I've assumed there's no matters that are going to degrade rapidly in that process. There are times when that comes down to 2 years or 1 year, but almost all schools are at 5 years for me. That said, almost all principals would far rather me go around, look at all the trees and do the assessment than to have to do it themselves. And so it's just a matter of them dealing with it. And the ISA and the BMP talks about 5-year cycles as being acceptable when there's no trees that are in that range that's of concern. And with the ISA, I'm guessing that's at least the high and the extreme. Most medium risks for the ISA probably, or in the BTRA, are probably tolerable. But certainly if you got rid of the mediums and just had the low, the low ones, I'd be back in 5 years. If I could. Now, why do we do them every year? Why in the Northern Territory is it done every 6 months? And the answer is we can strike the fear of God into people over trees. And as a profession, that's exactly what we've done. During the debacle with Bridget right here in New South Wales, we had at least 2 people on the committee advising Department of Education that the trees should be inspected by an arborist every 12 months. In Northern Territory, it's every 6 months. Trees don't change that rapidly except during severe weather events. And most severe weather events, as you saw, I think I showed you microburst stuff a few meetings ago. Is that right? Yep. So most of our severe weather events aren't actually severe weather events. They're just normal weather that we get in most years, and most don't see things failing. So a storm comes through, trees don't fall over every storm. The occasional piece here or there will go off in a storm, but in most storms, they're nothingness. So it's only when we're getting trees on or adjacent to the area that are getting damaged that I start to worry, and I'm worrying about peak winds. It's just the way it goes. It's not an everything situation. And I can give you an example of that. I just had there's an interesting one. And you can argue with me. By the way, I do have a video that I include, and I apologize for the vocal or the noise background on it. But so I tell them, that winds like this is when they should start planning to go inside. You can see the whole trees are swaying. So I've given them that as an example because when we use the Beaufort scale and we talk about these wind speeds, there's one thing between saying it and another thing in letting them see it. So this is something that we added this year. During this storm, a number of trees in schools were damaged. The winds that came through were fairly strong winds. And so that was a near gale wind. And we say that's near gale's a condition where you really shouldn't be doing much outside. You can still make movements, just be aware. But you shouldn't be playing outside. You shouldn't be sitting outside. That's sort of a no-brainer situation. So you might want to keep your eyes open for something like that, just to record and use. I think that might be even on my on my YouTube channel. If it is, you can find it and use it. Use the link. And so the Beaufort scale is this thing here, and that's just a way of looking at the effects of wind and being able to detect it on land. There's also a component that goes with the ocean. So this is a sailing thing. And of course, the sailors didn't want to have to go down to the seashore every day to have a look. So they wanted to figure it out. So fresh winds, the trees in leaf begin to sway, large branches in motion. So that's our strong winds, near gale, whole trees in motion, inconvenience felt when walking against the wind. So we're just coming into that range in that thing. And then next thing, gale, twigs break off, trees progress is generally impeded. And then 9, strong gale and branches are breaking off, and there's nothing much we can do. How does it go from near gale to strong gale? The answer is lots of things change that. But one of the things that does change that is topography. So that as our air gets compressed, it gets faster. So where you get air being pushed by buildings or pushed by terrain, you can get the winds changing fairly markedly in a fairly short period of time. So that deal with that issue. Yep. Thanks, Vicky. Okay, so yeah, it's just trying to communicate. We found talking about this difficult for them to understand. Showing them made a difference. And then here we've got it again. After weather events that cause trees to fail on the property or nearby properties, the tree should be inspected by a responsible adult for signs of broken limbs, fresh splits, signs of trees moving in the ground. Particular attention should be given to looking at trees in the register below. So we've already given them everything that we can to try and make that process easier for them to manage. And interestingly, that's what used to happen in New South Wales up until Bridget Wright's death. Principals, teachers, parents, the GA, students would see something, they'd call in the arborist and you'd go out and look at it and deal with it at that point in time. Is that, those of you who have been around, Mick, you've been around a while, Rob, you've been around, that's the way it used to happen. In New South Wales, that resulted in a risk of harm in general from trees in schools, including Bridget's death, of 1 in 43 million. The risk from trees in and adjacent to areas of high use in urban areas is 1 in 10 million. So schools were managing schools 4 times better than society as a whole. And the end result is we went and panicked. Now, as I said, you could argue a case that the kids are young and therefore you'd want to go double the protection, but we're at quadruple an already low risk. The schools were managing it fairly well already. So yes, my answer is 5 yearly is probably a good amount. There are areas where I would happily say, look, managing it or looking at it every 10 years is acceptable. If you had a tree that was sitting down that bottom end, might have been 1 in 50,000, 1 in 100,000 that, may change more rapidly. It's got a thin wall. It's an oak tree. It meets all the requirements, but it's, it might thin out a fair bit. In that situation, you might get back to inspecting it on an annual basis. And I can think of a tree like that. It's in, let me see if I can pull it straight away. Schofields. CHOF. It's the oldest planted tree in Blacktown. So they're fairly keen to keep it. No, it didn't come up. Oh yeah, it might do. No, it didn't. But it's an oak with a very thin wall left on it. And just so you get the picture, that's grey box. That's one of our stronger timbers, and that's damaged from a microburst. Just snapped it like it was a matchstick. What do you do to stop that? Nothing. And so, I think we get caught up with that being the same thing. Oh yeah, I get the point. That's failed. Anyone tell me why that failed? Come on, see if you can tell me what it failed.
Well, not properly attached in the first place, and
it's co-dominant stem, yeah, that has included
union.
Yep, that's right. And yet, reality is, if we were to be more objective, this failed because it had a great force applied to it, a force greater than it could resist, and that force was strong enough to break perfectly good things. So that goes to that issue of adequate. was it adequate? Well, if it was as adequate as a normal healthy tree, then the only other option, if that is not adequate, if that one's not adequate, is we need to get rid of every tree. That's not a good solution. In fact, that's a solution with a terminal consequence. The terminal consequence is we'll all die if we start doing that. So it makes absolutely no sense that we worry about these things, but because we can see why it failed, we explain it really well, and we say, "Oh, that's a weakness there." Well, yes, it is a weakness, but is it adequate? And the answer was, yeah, it was adequate right up until a wind of about 140 or 150 kilometers an hour. And that was the recorded wind speeds. When you see something like this, I know this little gully here definitely copped it harder. So,
Sorry, Mark, in that photo that you've got with the tree that's snapped in half, is it a microcarpa?
Mollicana.
Yeah.
Similar.
Mike Ellison was talking about this over in America, where they have a lot of cyclones, and they were saying that there's a hot spot where they snapped. Is that right?
There can be.
Okay.
Yeah. Because there are material properties, it's made to flex and it's made to be rigid, and we're trying to meld those two. What I can tell you is younger trees are far more flexible, older trees are far more rigid, but things just fail weirdly and wonderfully in those sort of events. And I mean, I love going over and having a look at them. This is just pure snapping of the fibers. You can see that they've just popped. Things break out. Just tree fails in the ground. Now I know this is a Campaniopsis, a tuckaroo, and they've all got codominant stems, all of them, but this is the one that failed. All the rest were adequate for 140 or 160 kilometer wind in the direction that it was coming from. And again, directionality, as we know, has an issue. So yeah, I love going out and seeing what's happened and why. What we did find in that particular storm is that grey boxes did fail at root plates where they'd been heavily stressed, and what it appeared as though it happened is when they were heavily stressed, the root system started having issues and they started failing. And this is fascinating. This is a tree that's growing in a gully area, and what do you see?
So rubbish and bottles and stuff.
Bottle. Yeah. And that's one of the things that we see definitely when it comes to moving big trees. We see them, these areas often have what we call herbic soils, that is soil with, the relics of buried material is really common in your inner city areas everywhere in Australia. So Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth. Why did it happen? The reason it happened is in the earlier days, Mick, where was the local tip? In the earlier days, what did you throw out?
Everything.
Almost nothing. There were no white goods that lasted 5 years that you bought from IKEA and then you threw out because you wanted to have a new one. You bought a lounge and that was the lounge that you had and probably your kids would have, and maybe the kids after them. There was no plastic packaging. There was no paper packaging, well, very little paper packaging. Things were very different if you go back 150 years ago. And so the small amount of debris that was produced was often just buried in people's yards rather than going to a tip. So interesting to see. Now, Rob asked the question about Sewell. Is that right, Rob? Did I get that?
Yes,
Or Yule, or whatever you want to have.
Safe, useful life expectancy.
Yeah, look, it's a difficult one, and I'll just open up the images again.
I take the view that it's purely it's all supposition, really. It's you're making a lot of assumptions that are not scientifically based, and
absolutely agree with you.
yeah.
It's something that people ask you because they don't know what to ask for, in my mind. what are you trying to get out of that information? Should I be retaining this tree or shouldn't I? And one of the nice things about doing these trees on multiple occasions on sites. So here's a tree, it's thinning out, it's Corymbia maculata. You can see that the canopy is quite thin. Little tips on the end are decline very rapidly within a matter of 1 year. And so the question is, what should I do about this? Now, if I was looking at that, I'd make an estimate, say, trees entered a spiral of decline, not so sure that it's going to survive, might be dead in the next 3 to 5 years. And that would be a fair and reasonable assumption. The only problem is 12 months later, the canopy is full and lush and there's not a thing wrong with it. Okay. And if I could show you how many times now that I've done that, so stressed trees, we just make the note that the tree's stressed, it'll either recover or it'll decline. If it continues to decline, it may die. If it dies, you'll need to address that at that time. But until then, I'm not putting my money on it. It's just not a good bet for me.
But the other thing I say is that I have no control over what happens to the tree unless it's in my own backyard.
And that's the case here. I mean, the only thing that happened here is the grounds assistant at this school, amazing guy, Tony, and I mean truly an amazing guy. I got a lot of time for him. When I first met him, he said, so, how hard is arboriculture? And I said, an idiot like me can do it, so anyone really can. And so he enrolled and got himself a diploma in arboriculture whilst he's been a GA at the school. And he is doing some great works at the school. And I find that just really encouraging. This planting program, all the trees are planted and irrigated for the first 12 months. That's pretty unique. And he'll plant probably 50 plus trees a year on the school grounds and do things like, I'm going to plant myself a bunya. Yeah, you know that they're going to drop big cones. It's a low use area of the school. Perfectly fine to put it there. I know that already, Mark. So I think that's great. And this is in the main quadrangle of that school. When I say the main quadrangle, let me go to their school and I'll show you exactly where it is. And this will give you an idea as to how we can start changing the approach that we've got to trees. In my mind, he's done a fantastic job. Down the back, it's in this tree here. Now that's definitely in a building footprint. They roost there for 4 months of the year, every year, in the middle of a high school. And I think that, as I said, just says so much about how they're approaching arboriculture in that school. So I got a lot of time for him. All of this here was all turned into car park whilst they were working on this. And this is his latest rehab. He put in 86 trees in this region here and to replant and get it growing again. So yeah, Craig Hallam did a talk at the Arboricultural Association in the UK. So it's a Francis and Taylor publication. And he looked at the data that's collected in tree surveys. And tree surveying is something that I just think is an unfortunate evil. It's a horrible thing to say, but collecting all that data has to have some use. And I think the most important piece of data you can ever collect about trees is where is there a planting spot. So power lines are on that side of the road, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, they've got some planted in there. Thank goodness for Tony, hey? So that's the information I'd want to collect. How tall the tree is, maybe of some benefit. We're not very good at estimating height, and measuring height takes too long. Measuring canopy spread, we're reasonably good at estimating DBH, and most DBH is not measured. Why not? Time, yeah. If you're talking about a street tree inventory or a inventory of a university or even a caravan park, they're just estimates. So we're pretty good at estimating DBH, and we just go backwards from there. When it comes to Yule and Sewell, Craig Hinton, Craig, I think I said Craig Hinton. Craig Hinton said that it was the least reliable piece of information they collected. So having someone pay me to collect a piece of information that I know is unreliable seems to be a foolish thing to do. Now, we'll talk about it in general terms, but, to specifically say this tree is going to die, I get it wrong. I get it wrong about what part's going to fail. I got it wrong about when things are going to fail. And you may tell me, and Mick, please let me know, if you've got a lot better hit rate than that, let me know, and I'm happy to retire. But I can't seem to get it right, And
So do you think useful life expectancy should be left out of a preliminary tree report?
I think useful life expectancy should be out of the standard altogether for things. It's just a guesstimate. I think a more accurate thing is the longevity of the species in general. And there's another thing, and I think we've talked about this before. The death curves that we look at, we think about as a human being, you get to 80, and I know this one fairly well, 84. At 84, you get to 84, on average, you've got 4 more years to live. Doesn't make sense when the average person lives, the average male only lives to 81, almost 82. But it works like that because the older you get a few extra years because you're in that survival group because people earlier have died. Trees aren't like that. The biggest mortality rate's young. As trees get older, their likelihood of survival increases significantly. And think about it. They've gone through a 1 in 20 flood. They've gone through a 1 in 20 drought. They've gone through a 1 in 20 storm event when they're 20 years of age. When they're 100 years, they've gone through a 1 in 100 probably. So the likelihood of them failing becomes lower the older they get. And that's why we get...
Mark, instead of dealing with Sewell or Yule, which I don't do, I still try and address that issue by making an assessment of the retention value of the tree, and the length that it is expected to live is only one fairly minor part of that assessment, but other things like its ecological value, its
stroke value, its amenity value, if
it's got a historic value, if it's got some of these other values, and then that will inform whether or not the tree should be retained.
Yeah, look, I think my view, and I've discussed this before, the tree's healthy, and it's not a undesirable species, so it's not a weed species or something that we'd want to otherwise get rid of. It's a tree that's going to offer reasonably good retention value. It doesn't mean that it has to be retained. The problem that I get with the standard, and it'll be interesting to see what the committee comes up with in the review. The issue that I've got is it doesn't consider the impact on development, and trees that are in the middle of let's say we're going to turn this into a dual occupancy. Where can we do a dual occupancy here? I want to try and find something that's suitable that'll illustrate the point well. Okay, yeah, we're going to put a dual occupancy in on this property, number 12. Well, trees that are not near the boundary are going to be susceptible to needing to be removed. Even better still, this one here, look at that. Well, if that's not on the boundary, that's in the yard, we're going to have problems in getting a development. So what do you say? It's a tree that's got a high retention value, but no possibility of being retained because of its location.
Well, because it's got a high retention value doesn't mean that it must be retained. It just means that it should be retained if possible.
Yeah, and I'm bang smack on. There it is in the middle of the yard. And
it may be that if it's got a high retention value and you can come up with a design solution to retain it, then that's worthwhile pursuing. Whereas if a tree's got a low retention value, you probably wouldn't worry about trying to change the design.
That's a fair comment. So my division point, if If I'm not doing a preliminary, if I'm doing a preliminary tree assessment, I look at it very differently. But if we know we're going to put a dual occupancy in here, and that's what's being put to the council, my argument is that tree probably has a fairly low value because the cost and the inconvenience of trying to, and the difficulty of trying to do something around that tree is almost makes it impossible. So it becomes do we sterilize the site or do we do the development? Now, I know Peter and I have had this discussion, but I think one of the problems here is that we undervalue the value of the tree, and it may well be that at some stage or other we need to say, look, this is a $65,000 tree, and to give us $65,000 worth of new plantings, we need to go ahead with this. And it may be that even at some stage or other we'll get a local council that says, look, yes, we could even get 2 trees going in the front yard here for 5 years before this one goes. I suspect in time we'll see the value of trees go up, not just the fiscal value, but how important they are.
I take the view that if a tree constitutes a material constraint to the development, but it still has a high retention value, then at some point you need to make a judgment as to whether or not the tree is more important than the development.
And that's right.
Spoken about should be taken into account, but at the end of the day, at some point, you've got to make the decision: is this development more important than the tree?
And I guess it depends on what perspective you're looking at that from, Peter, because I'm not the consent authority. So it really is incumbent on the consent authority to make that decision.
I agree. It is incumbent. And so I think my job is to provide as much relevant information to those stakeholders so that they can make an informed decision.
I think that's a reasonable position, Peter. I don't have any issues with that.
But I don't think providing a SUL value really advances that cause.
Well, it's interesting because the SUL, of course, is the precursor to TREE-AZ, and both of them are tools that are meant to be used with the British standard to assess trees on development sites. And the TREE-AZ approach is somewhat similar to what we all do naturally. That is, the trees that have little to no value as these, so dead trees, weed species, trees that are exempt, and even some trees that are exempt. I went out to a site the other day, and there's an Erebotria or a loquat tree on the boundary, and I said, look, I know it's an exempt species. I said to the arborist for the developer, I was working for the council on that one, weird. I said, look, I know it's an exempt species. I know you can remove it, but even if you just kept it for the first 2 or 3 years after you built the 4-story building, at least it'll give some screening to the neighbours. So it's not without value. It's just that it's a client can go and remove it, but smart developer is one that utilizes the resources appropriately, and so that would be one that I'd say leave it. There was a couple of phoenixes on that side. We said same thing. You can screen out half of the neighbour's backyard with just moving 3 trees and leaving 1, and you're not going to resolve the problem, but you're going to help reduce the issues.
But if you have a tree with a low retention value, that doesn't mean that it should be removed. It just means that it can be removed if you want to.
Well, the working out the retention value is not a component that's done at the arboricultural impact assessment. It's a component that's done at the design stage. So it is the intention of the retention value is to help the design team making decisions. And as I said, occasionally I get one that is a preliminary tree assessment, proper preliminary tree assessment, but I'd have to say 95% of my development site work, they've already got close to final plans, and I'm trying to tweak things rather than having input to the design. Is anyone else doing them out there that finds similar?
I wouldn't
sure.
95%. Certainly the majority is, but it's not that high.
Yeah, well, you're in a nice little area, Peter, because you've only sort of become tree aware up there in the last 10 years. So I think you're not burdened with traditional behaviour as much as Sydney.
I find a lot of developments, they are looking for arboricultural input in the earlier stages because it just makes it easier for them to do the design. If they know that, okay, well, we've got a constraint here because of this tree, then they can take that into account when they're doing the design. So yeah, I get quite a few instances where I'm involved earlier on.
Yeah, look,
My biggest customer, who claims to be number 6 in size in Australia, has me do the preliminaries first, and they're almost a year behind with the designs.
that's pretty remarkable, Rob.
I think it is, yeah.
And, you know, I mean, I get even worse. I got one the other day, and I don't know, I can share it with you. Just be sensible with confidentiality of details, but complete. If I open it up and zoom down quickly enough, we'll be out of the bulk stuff. But this is a development site, and they've got approval. Now I have to do an arboricultural impact assessment report. There's an approval. How the hell am I meant to do with that? And let me, oops, up one. Here's our 3 trees. One here, and I'm not sure where this one is, but I've got a feeling the trunk is about here. Council's approved it with the 3 trees staying. Yeah, you know, it's just madness.
Mark, wouldn't you just do the report and report on what's there and what you can see, and that the fact that they've already got approval doesn't matter? Just let the facts fall where they lie, and
Yeah,
they can deal with it. If they have to get an amendment to their approval to deal with that, then so what?
exactly what I've done, Peter, but it's so frustrating because what I would say is, you know, maybe this building should have been tweaked slightly to bring that back if they wanted to retain that tree. And the splay on the driveway on this one, I'm not even sure that, again, the trees aren't, the centers of the trees aren't plotted. The canopies are shown to be indicative. So, and again, that one that I was in court with last week, same process. You know, I said, I'm not convinced that the trees are correctly plotted even. So I need to have some assurance of that before I start feeling comfortable with the saying what to do. So yeah, I've come up with a practical solution here, Peter. My this is tree protection zone. This is load sharing surface through here. I've suggested that anywhere where they're going to excavate within 12 times trunk diameter of the tree, they excavate the edge. I've got it up here. It's marked up. For any excavation that is within 12 times trunk diameter any tree, hand dig the margin closest to the tree and have the project arborist inspect. At that point in time, I can start making some decisions. You know, how much deeper do you want to go? How much area do you want to cover? It may be possible to retain those trees, and I'm forever amazed at how tolerant trees are, but I think it's pushing the limits. I think this is us back around. The correct way to do this is for this report to guide the changes, or in fact, the preliminary, Rob, as you do, guides the original design, and then would have changed that whole process completely. And you know, it hasn't done that, and I think the site has suffered for it, and I think we'll lose 2 out of the 3 trees. And again, silly little things like these are replacement Waterhausia floribundas. Well, they're nice, but why would you put a Waterhausia floribunda in the corner underneath the jacaranda? Why wouldn't you put it there? Under the neighbour's jacaranda. Why would you put Waterhausia floribunda here essentially right on top of the tree's trunk, almost right on top of it.
Mm.
And it's just, again, no regard for the tree at all until the stage that I've got this. And this is an approved
So, Mark, how could they have approved that without an arborist report?
Ah, Vicky, I wish I could answer that. There's a group of consulting arborists in Australia that have a whole pile of their members that specialise in writing reports that say the Arboricultural Impact Assessment Report, the tree protection plan, and the tree protection drawing will come once the DA is approved. And I just find that just crazy. And there was a push amongst one state for the revision to look at something on that stage. And I said, if after the DA is approved, you can say what needs to be done, you can do it beforehand. It's just ridiculous to do it the other way around. And I've seen big councils approve it, and I've seen worse than that. I've seen the court approve it. I just find that, again, just comes from a lack of knowledge or understanding. Is that fair enough? So, and the other thing that worries me about this tree, so this one's fairly vulnerable because it's already, I would say, 70%. It's a fair to good tree, not a good tree. It always worries me when you're stressing a good tree. Having said that, it only takes one guy with a hose once a fortnight, once a month to water the trees on the development site and not to compact the crap out of all of this area. And the damn things will thrive in it. So, you hope that happens, but I suspect that I'll come back. The other thing is these are going to get sold. And I suspect that the first thing the person that buys them is going to say is, I want to get rid of this tree. It's closer than 3 meters to the building. Therefore, I can get rid of it. And that's a silly one this is Blacktown Council. Blacktown Council has 3 meters from the perimeter of the building. And at no point in the development control plan in their legislation do they define what the perimeter of the building is. And it's arguable that it's the gutter. At least Ku-ring-gai say it's a wall. Having said that, Ku-ring-gai allows you to prune stuff that's overhanging the building. And I don't quite get that, because every time you raise the canopy of material over the building, you increase the likelihood of building damage. So my view, the smarter move there is to address the gutter issue. Happy with that? So, yeah, look, it's a difficult thing coming up with an approach to these problems, because even retention value is subjective. What makes one tree of high value to one person is not going to be the same necessarily for someone else. So my view, and it's based on something that Scott Wilkie said, and I know we've had Scott on before, where Scott said, I don't care whether you tell me the retention value, because I'm going to make my mind up on it anyhow. You tell me that it's low and I think that it's medium. You tell me that it's high and I think that it's essential. It's got nothing to do with what you've written. I'll just ignore it. The only thing that I do have as essential all the time is any tree on an adjoining property. I believe that under law we owe a burden to ensure that we don't significantly harm or kill or destabilize a tree of a neighbouring property. I think that comes. I know, Rob, in Victoria it definitely is the same. You've got a similar piece of legislation. Don't know what you've got in Perth, but in New South Wales, it's arguably a criminal offence, even with consent. So the council's given you consent to build up to the boundary and put a basement in there, and that it has an effect on the tree. You just didn't give a damn about it. So it's reckless indifference. And so I'd be more concerned. That's a Coleroteria. I think they're going to find it suckering everywhere rather than dying. And that'll be payback for the design again. It is just, it is what it is. It's not good design. And it's what we're seeing a lot more of, this typical infill development. That's a 600 square metre block of land divided now into 2 blocks of land. 300 square meters. Just find it hard to consider how you and big houses. The two things together, and then this thumping big amount of concrete, you know. And the built form on that site is probably close to 50%. 50% heat capturing. You know, the only thing that I do have to say is that, and I don't know how Waterhouse is, I don't think they go particularly well for you, Mick, in WA, but Waterhouses do really well for us in Sydney. Rob, are they using them in Melbourne yet?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, look, they're a good medium-sized tree. I think the one thing that we don't do when it comes to specifying trees well is we think about size rather than growth rates. And I think the one thing that I felt was unfortunate in the Australian Standard for Nursery Stock was that we didn't talk about coming up with a growth rate response. So a tree that puts on 300 mils a year is going to be far less problematic than a tree that puts, you know, a metre of new growth on every year. And so Waterhouse is good in that it is a reasonable sized tree as it gets older, but it's got a growth rate that's slower than, say, something like Eucalyptus pileularis or Eucalyptus teraticornis, for example, would be endemic to the site. So yeah, that's something to think about. And it's something to think about in how you communicate. People have this view of trees that's very much like their view of people and pets. That is, trees get to a certain size and they stop growing. Commonly held view on trees. You know, the classic slate and greens hedges, how big do they grow? Any guesses? I know the nursery industry sell them with labels that say greater
Maybe 10 meters.
6 meters, 8 meters, 10 meters. There is actually a specimen out there, I believe, that's already about 46 meters in height. So, you know, 46 meters is 12 and a bit stories. That's not a small tree. You know, so
Sounds like a decent hedge, though.
oh, it makes a great hedge. And I'm serious. I do a well-maintained Leighton's green hedge is spectacular, but a well-maintained hedge for me is 2 to 3 times a year pruning. You know, once a year, and it's going to get to be a runaway hedge. And it's a real problem. Okay, guys, any other questions for tonight? Great. Hopefully that gave you some things to think about, some things that you might want to look at adding to your systems and dealing with. Next time round, I said we'd look at a more formalized process of an expert witness report and look at some of the requirements and some of the law that goes with it. And I'll share with you a recent experience. At the moment, I can't do it because the matter's not finalised yet. But where there was criticism of what I'd done, and justifiably, you know, the brief that I got given was dubious, to say the least. And, you know, that led to a series of run-on problems. So I'll share that with you and show you how that's something you can address and deal with.
Thanks so much.
Again,
Thank you.
my pleasure.
Thanks, Mark.